Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 24, Episode 12. Coming up on the show, we've got the psychic manifestations of the night siege, Romanian tree invisibility holes, and when your best friend is an MK Ultra agent. I'm Benjamin Grundy, joining me is Aaron Wright.
I promise you that middle headline has nothing to do with Eastern European weird porn.
Forget about the Romanian part and the tree. What is an invisibility hole?
It's literally that.
What does it do?
It's a hole in a tree that causes you to become invisible.
Isn't any hole an invisibility hole because you're in a hole?
No, it doesn't work that way, but you're missing the context of the story. That's the whole point of the headline. It leaves you wondering, what's an invisibility hole?
It's definitely leaving me wondering.
We will get into that later on in the show, I promise you.
What an interesting show where we have a bunch of stories that have no conclusions.
Well, this is what happened. So yesterday, I started doing this research on ancient atomic warfare, and I'm actually really looking forward to putting it together. And I didn't realize it kind of, forgive the pun, but it mushroomed out into this gigantic story that I don't have enough time to prepare this.
Oh, one of those big ones.
Yeah, like a huge story. So I thought I'm going to have to give it a few more days to do some more research. So I was going through my my old library, and as I did, I came across this PDF that I haven't looked into in a long time. It's Night Siege, the Northern Ohio UFO Creature Invasion. Now, for some reason, in the back of my mind, I've been skipping over this story for a long time because I kept on thinking that it was the Hopkinsville incident, even though they're nowhere near each other.
You just associated them.
Yeah, there was this thing, even though it's Ohio, I was like, oh,
goblins, caves,
yeah,
aliens.
People being sieged, yeah, I don't mind. No, it's an incredible story that seems to have its roots in, it's almost Skinwalker-esque type activity. It's like Skinwalker Ranch before Skinwalker Ranch.
It's like Skinwalker Ranch mixed with Rex Gilroy.
Oh, well, yeah, there is a little bit of plaster casts that are thrown in there. Yes, a couple of three-toed footprints that look very suspicious do show up. But essentially, this poor farming family is attacked, for the lack of a better word, by these beings that appear to be ape-like beings. But then there's something even more non-physical about them. And we'll get into that in the plus extension of the show. But what have you got coming up?
There's a new book by Bette Williams, The Wild Kindness, a psilocybin odyssey. It's been a while since we had a good psilocybin odyssey on the show. And this book has great blurbs from writers I enjoy, like Eric Davis. He said, like a trip, this builds and plateaus but never settles down. For the sake of all those newbies seeking psychedelic transformation, he writes, I almost hope she becomes a guru, but she'd hate that, and that's why she's awesome. So I thought, okay, I'll bite. Let's check out this new psychedelic guru. And the bar's been set pretty high on this show. We've had some incredible tales of psychedelic experiences, ayahuasca and DMT and magic mushrooms and everything else. I think the recent setting of the new high standard came from Dale McLeod with the Big Dream book. Remember that one?
Well, at the risk of sounding crass, wasn't the one where she was showing her lady bits to the entities in the shower?
Oh, yeah, just flashing her pussy to everyone, to her mum.
That's right.
That was the highlight of the book. But no, remember Albert Einstein? She took a bunch of ayahuasca, and then Albert Einstein and Nelson Mandela show up in her apartment.
Yeah.
And they let her know that they're not dead. They're actually Illuminati members. And Dale's been selected to go on an Illuminati mission and retrieve the green emerald of power that will save the world.
How could I forget? Great book.
So, yeah, I mean, this is the standard that we're trying to hit with a psychedelic story. But I am intrigued because Eric Davis is a fantastic writer, and he's saying that Bette Williams is on the money. So early on, she shares her first mushroom experience at the age of 15. Nothing too out of the ordinary occurs. She ends up losing her job because she admits to her boss what she did the night before, and her dreams are crushed because she loses a job for admitting she had mushrooms.
Isn't 15 a little bit young to be taking mushrooms?
Yeah, but things seem to get more interesting later in life. 20 years later, she said, I found myself in a dangerous downward swirl. She just published a novel in her late 20s that received strong reviews, but she was going through a bit of a creative dry spell. She had that writer's block. She wasn't writing, she said. She was absent from the wheel of her own destiny, and even worse, she was kind of fine with it, which was a bit of a problem. She was just getting really complacent. But she said it was through the body of a dying cottonwood tree that mushrooms landed in my life for good. Its branches dangled over my house where I lived, and she ended up calling over her friend Sophia to come over and cut down the branches of this dangerous tree, because in the next storm it would have come through the house. And for some reason, when her friend was up there chopping these branches for her, this totally random question just came out of nowhere, just popped into her head to ask this. She asked a friend, "Oh, you don't have any magic mushrooms, do you?" And her friend kind of looked down at her and thought, that is a weird question to ask, but actually, yeah, I do. I do have them. She said I was about to meet an utterly foreign entity, a being with whom I would enter into a partnership. It began with a solitary trip by the fire 3 days later, she said, with a cautious less than 3 gram dose. She was lying down on the couch under a wool blanket and she just waited. And she said the mushrooms started talking to her. "You need to stop seeing yourself as a sick person," they said. She's just hearing mushrooms in her mind. She said they spoke to me like this in fully formed sentences, heard internally, almost like recalling a memory. "In your female form," they said, "you are the quintessential bedridden Victorian lady on retreat." And she said, yes, it's true. I do come from a long line of sick women. My mother had polio, tuberculosis, cancer, and Graves' disease. She said my grandmother had tuberculosis and a morphine addiction.
That is one hell of a cross to bear.
Sickness is how I locate my ancestry, she said. And the mushrooms started to mock her. They started to go, "Oh, I'm very sick. Oh, woe is me. Look how
I've got a morphine addiction.
Oh, look how sick I am." And she kind of had this conversation, this back and forth, where she said, "Well, you don't care that I'm sick? Or we're just waiting for you to stop pretending to be sick," the mushroom said. "But I am actually kind of sick," she said. And the mushrooms just kind of patiently said, "Well, take your time. You'll figure it out eventually." And they went on to explain to her that she wasn't actually sick. It was the Trader Joe's frozen Greek yogurt she had in the freezer.
What, it's expired?
Well, because she was eating it every day, the mushrooms told her it was causing inflammation in her hips, and that was having a flow-on effect to her neck. And it was this kind of energy traffic jam in her body that was making her depressed and lethargic, and that's why she couldn't write anything and why she was just a complete hot mess. The damage could apparently be remedied with ginger. And the mushrooms explained this to her in her mind. She's like, "Ginger? You mean just ginger?" And it says, "Yes, ginger. Let us show you." And all of a sudden, this intricate, multi-dimensional golden temple starts rising in front of her. She can see it floating like a 3D model kind of in front of her third eye. And it's this silhouette of this temple. It's vast and bejeweled, she said. There's an empty throne at its center. And she's so enamored with its beauty. She starts hyperventilating from its splendor, she says. She said, "The mushrooms must like me for such a thing to arise. Maybe I'm good at this whole mushroom trip thing," she thought. And it had all these personal preferences, like her favorite colors and favorite jewels were embedded in this incredible golden temple. And then it suddenly occurs to her, "Is this ginger?" And the mushroom's like, "Yeah, you get it. This is ginger. This is the form of ginger in another dimension. It's this weird kind of
Moroccan
palace, golden." And she says, "Well, should I take it ground or fresh?" And they basically say, "Fresh is best, just keep it simple." And that's the end of the trip. So it's kind of a great first story. She has this amazing back and forth where mushrooms are kind of sassy. The Trader Joe's yogurt in her freezer she's been eating every day is the cause of her problems.
I was trying to rationalize it from a scientific standpoint because we've heard in the past few years that scientists have been suggesting that you can utilize psilocybin to help people overcome psychological conditions and anxiety and those sorts of things. And I was thinking, oh, well, obviously she's got some type of, Munchausen's issue or, she's got some type of mental illness and clearly she's just simply taking these drugs and the psilocybin is working. No, it's literally telling her that the Trader Joe's yogurt is making her sick.
Yeah. She says, "The mushrooms speak to me now. I don't hear words like you'd hear from another person talking. It's as if language arises in my own body, though it's nothing I'd come up with on my own. Sometimes," she said, "I am aware of fully formed sentences, but other times whole systems of knowledge present themselves devoid of any coherent words at all." She said, "The mushrooms told me addiction starts in the feet, for instance." And she suddenly...
Whoa. They told her addiction start in the feet.
Yeah, well, this is the problem. She doesn't elaborate. She's given all this wisdom, but she doesn't explain it. She then kind of shares a vision of becoming... a sheepdog, there's a vision of a sheep herder and a foal is being born, this newly born foal, and she becomes the foal. And as her leg, her front left leg makes contact with the earth, she feels like this subtle electrical flow from Gaia kind of go up her leg and give her life, and it comes in through her hips and up to her neck, and it's like a mirror of the physical issues she's experiencing as a human being. And she then becomes the old man. She becomes the old sheep herder. And he's got a cane and he's kind of injured, and then the voice of the mushrooms cut back in, and they're like, you just want to take the shape of this old man because he's slightly crippled. And remember, because she loves, oh, woe is me,
so he's
I'm
focusing
sick.
on the psychology, her psychology.
Yeah. And she says to mushrooms, she says, well, look, I am kind of crippled. And mushrooms just says, look, you can stay in that loop as long as you like. But really, I mean, come on. There's nothing wrong with you. She says, okay, I'm not crippled, but I'm just a little bit sick. You're not sick, Mushroom says. You're not sick. You just keep saying you're sick. You're not sick. But she says, what am I supposed to do in a healing ceremony if I'm not sick? Because this is a special tobacco-inspired natives healing ceremony that she's doing. She says, today I'm living in the mushroom's wordless answer to this question continually. She said, I learnt how to literally suck the sickness out of my body and spit it out. I was given poses, mouth wide open, tongue out, eyes rolled all the way up into my skull. Mushrooms showed me the resentments to which I was clinging and helped me to let them go. And I found that an intriguing thing to state, because this is what shamans do in traditional healing ceremonies. We see this in ayahuasca ceremonies as well, this kind of sucking of the illness and then spitting something out. This is seen in a lot of traditional cultures. But again, she doesn't elaborate. She doesn't elaborate when she first learnt that. How did it work?
Well, maybe she doesn't understand either, and that's not a slight in her. It's just that it's never explained. It's almost like, a light turns on and you don't really care how electricity works.
Yeah, but you would think you would at least share how you learnt to suck illness out of your body.
Well, that is true. Yeah, well, at least describe it.
But she's building to something, and I feel like there's some kind of breakthrough experience that might open to a path of internal wisdom. And later she even starts to touch on the idea of sentience and intelligence in the mushroom itself, the idea that there's consciousness in the spores, which is something we've explored on the show before. And I find this incredibly interesting. She says that mushrooms reproduce asexually. They release microscopic spores, of course. They travel in the air and on the backs of birds and beasts. They can lodge in the straw hat of a farmer or the T-shirt of a tourist boarding a plane. She said they are programmed to reach for the farthest yonder. They want to be everywhere. The largest living thing on Earth, she says, is a honey fungus in Oregon whose network reaches almost 2.5 miles. Other kinds of mushrooms mitigate bee colony collapse, break down hydrocarbons in oil spills, and filter E. coli out of water. She's obviously enamored with the world of fungus, and it is, fascinating. But she then touches on, something that we love to talk about, where mushrooms often employ mobility-obsessed humans, but landing on a straw hat or a T-shirt can be labor-intensive. Human bodies are unclean. It's much more fruitful for the spores to embed themselves in our minds. Now, I can't remember where we first heard these ideas, but it immediately made sense to me that the mushroom itself is sentient. It's a sentient entity, and it understands that it needs a harmonious environment to survive. And by kind of encouraging human beings, when human beings ingest magic mushrooms, it gets into their minds and turns them into greeny nature lovers because that's beneficial to the mushroom. It kind of hijacks their consciousness. Now, she says through culture and human relationships, the mushrooms get us to do their bidding. She references the ethnobotanist Kathleen Harrison, who wrote in the MAPS journal. She said, be careful, I must warn you, watch your step. The plants and fungi have been known to hijack humans, many of us. Of course, those who've been hijacked have been pretty darn happy about it, so there's that. But so many people have turned towards plants, turned towards growing things from what they thought was their career. It's laughable, she says. I find that really, really fascinating, that there's just your normal average day like an engineer going out and having a magic mushroom. And then the mushroom starts to control his psyche, where being an engineer isn't as important anymore as growing trees and protecting the earth.
Well, I mean, it's almost like it reminds me of a virus in a way, in that there's no specific, malintent, there. It's more that this is just a living being. It needs to reproduce and it needs to survive. Its species needs to survive. So you hijack another species to get what you want out of it. So I could understand that it potentially, from an evolutionary perspective, would have the power to, on a psychic, once it's ingested, on a psychic level, cause someone to change their entire way of life to facilitate its way of life.
But does that mean that what it's communicating to the minds it's hijacking is some kind of lie or half-truth?
Definitely. Potentially, yeah.
Stop everything you're doing. Yeah. Make sure you plant lots of mushrooms.
Yeah.
I think the last time we covered this, the researcher was theorizing that they encourage people to, or there's something about encouraging them to grow near paths so that people pick them up. Like the spores know where to go so that they'll be picked up by humans so they can infect more minds.
Oh, it's really intelligent.
Kind of fascinating thing to think about. Obviously, that's not accepted in any mainstream views.
No.
It's just kind of a wild theory. So she describes her next experience, which is chronologically a bit out of order. This was in her mid-20s. She was living in New Mexico, and she tells kind of a long story about meandering down to this dry creek bed, when she's high, just wandering down, going for a walk, and just, laying in the desert. And she says that the plants and the trees started communicating with her. Patches of various types of grasses started talking to her. And they essentially said, hey, this is where we hang out next to those guys over there. And the grasses are pointing at other shrubs or something. Insects and birds move in between the space of us. Coyotes move our seeds around. We enjoy each other's company quite a lot. Take all day, send thank you notes. It's a very smart situation. Haha, we're grasses. Look at us.
So she's talking to the intelligence of the plants?
They sound like a bunch of weirdos, these grasses. They've got nothing intelligent
Well, everyone
to say.
knows that grasses are the weirdos of the plant world.
She says, I recall making a mental note that this was a better way to be in the world, and I must not forget to come back to mushroom land more often. What, to have meaningless conversations with grasses about what coyotes do in them? Why? But again, I like this stuff. Like, I like these stories where people put themselves into altered states of consciousness and they commune with nature in a way that is really much more tangible than the nonsense hippie stuff that you usually hear of, oh, everything's connected, everything's one. But no, I want to hear...
How do you think it's more tangible?
Because I want to hear actual conversations. I want to sit down with a mulberry bush. I just want to have a back and forth, like a one-on-one.
But about what? I'm probably going to tell you about how much it lacks fertilizer.
I don't know, talk politics or philosophy or anything. Just, something interesting. But then the third mushroom trip 3 years later, I think really exemplifies why that's kind of a meaningless activity. Because she says, I took the mushrooms with a girlfriend and walked down to the same arroyo, like the same riverbed, dry riverbed. And she starts communing with the rocks. And she said the rocks started commenting on what she was wearing. And the rock said that the jacket she bought at the mall...
I can just imagine, honey, that doesn't work on you.
Look, honey, that jacket is gross. She bought this jacket at the mall and it had NASCAR patches on it. And the rocks told her that what she was wearing was offensive to all of nature.
Is that because NASCAR puts out a lot of carbon dioxide emissions?
I don't know
why, or is it just overall that it's...
I don't know if it's related to NASCAR. Maybe it was just a really ugly jacket.
Yeah,
It's a really
jacket.
I think that's what it is. I don't think it matters that there's a NASCAR thing on it. It's just a horrible jacket.
That jacket makes you look like trash.
And the rocks found it offensive to all of nature. She says, while this was good advice, it was not a teaching that left me hijacked, not even close.
You end up being offended. You're like, well, I'm not coming back here again.
So I'm getting some interesting stories, but I'm not getting the path to wisdom that I was hoping. But the teaching that did hijack her, that was her God trip. And she explains that it's common for, a person to do mushrooms many times before having what the literature calls the God trip. She says for some people it never happens, and she mentioned that she kept thinking it was happening every time she took them until it actually happened. And she realized what a different experience it was, especially to her previous trips.
So being called the God trip, I'm assuming that you meet something as the equivalent of God.
Yeah, it's like a consciousness shifting experience that you're I guess forever changed from. And she says it's logical you'd attribute this to a higher dose, but in her case, it was just, the normal amount of dose. It was less than 2 grams. But the day before, she said her girlfriend had given her an incredible massage, like a Rolfing massage. I don't know if you've ever had a Rolfing massage. It's a specific deep muscle or deep tissue technique. And her friend basically said to her the day before, look, I worked on you really hard, and you may want to be aware that your body will be integrating the experience. And the next day she just takes a few magic mushrooms and she's like, no shit. It's definitely integrating something, because she had her God trip. And the problem is she doesn't really go into detail. She gives us the general, everything is one, everything's integrated, interconnectivity of all living things. She has this incredible ecstasy. She gives a bit of detail on the fidelity of the experience. She says everything was hugely specific, like being able to sense the nutrition in the weeds growing outside the house. That's pretty cool. And that's the kind of thing where I wish you would stop and then maybe even later come back and write down those thoughts and then actually get the weed and test it and find out if she was right.
Yeah, because then you could validate it.
That's the kind of stuff I want to hear. Like that crazy plant outside, did you have some kind of knowledge that you couldn't have gotten from any other means? But she just says she understood the nutrition that was growing in that weed. She said the clothes the neighbors were wearing in their bedrooms and kitchens, she knew all the intricate details on what they were doing, what they were wearing, what they were cooking, how exactly those neighbors held whatever amounts of kindness they had in their hearts. So again, like a really fine-tuned psychic ability, I guess you could say.
Yeah, but all that would make sense if you understand the interconnected nature of how everything is linked. It literally is everything from physical things, non-physical things, emotions, nutrition, obviously.
She says very broadly, biological, social, and mechanical networks revealed themselves and made sense, everything adding up to there being just enough on Earth to keep us alive spiritually and physically. And then she says, if only we could step out of the illusion of capitalist commerce. I'm just
so
like,
now we're going to head down the postmodern path.
Here we go.
I had a feeling this was starting to feel a little bit postmodern.
Here we go. That's right. The grand wisdom she learns from taking magic mushrooms, apart from being able to sense the components of weed and psychically tune into her neighbors, she understands that we need to step away from capitalism. My God. The intellectual epiphany, she said, was coupled with the feeling that every single cell in my body was fully alive. It was as if I'd been half dead previously and was all at once given the body of an athlete. Emotions that usually revealed themselves in me with an assured familiarity, love and joy, for instance, now took on layered and subtle dimensions as if new notes had been invented on a musical scale, and she could play these emotions like an instrument, she said. She said she had a PhD level intricacy that permeated all things. So again, kind of fascinating stuff. It's amazing how that description coincides with what people describe when they leave their body or they have near-death experiences, that previously they were half dead. Previously, they weren't living a real existence. It's only when they stepped out of their physical body that reality was finally revealed and they felt the true nature of being.
It sounds like on some level she's undergone a form of ego death. Like the old form that she was has obviously passed away, and these mushrooms possibly have allowed her to be like a butterfly to break out of the chrysalis.
And she finds it all overwhelming. She's crying and just saying thank you over and over. She can't believe that a mushroom can do this. It's a complete miracle. And she ends up saying in the end, why me? I'm just a chick at home in the wrong house with the wrong girlfriend on a Tuesday in the daytime, and I get to have this experience. And she kind of finishes by saying, everyone should have this experience. Everyone should be able to experience this. But what follows, I mean, the reviewers kind of feel, and I imagine she thinks this as well, it's a raw expression of the intersectionality of psychedelics and the evils of colonialism and the patriarchy. But what it actually is the intersectionality of bad writing and many, many failed lesbian relationships. Like, there's like 20 plus girlfriends and it just goes horribly wrong.
Yeah, I heard the saying, I think it's after your 10th lesbian relationship you would go socialist. So I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not.
It's a train wreck. I will admit it's an entertaining train wreck, but there's no kind of, like she's giving these broad strokes about this amazing experience, but there's not really any wisdom there. It's not like she learns from the experience and then gets her life together. She's just a bit of a mess forever and nothing ever changes. The most interesting part, though, in this book is where she's having a conversation with this character in the story named Rosie. And Rosie's kind of lying on her bed and Bet's lying next to her. And well, the question came up of who's Rosie, but I'll fill you in on that later because it took me a while to figure it out. But essentially, she says to Rosie, look, stop, you're creeping me out, because Rosie's just staring intently into her eyes. And Rosie says, look, I need you to ask me if I have a microchip. And Bet, the author, says, why would I ask you that? She says, just ask me. Rosie, do you have a microchip? Thank God you finally asked me that. Oh my God, I can't say anything unless you ask, Rosie, do you have a microchip? It's a trigger code. And finally, I can tell you, it's been really hard. I just have to tell you this. I really have to tell you this. I figured you'd know by now because you've been watching YouTube videos on MK Ultra in the bath all week, and nothing I could do could get through to you. And she basically explains, Rosie explains that she's the CIA agent. And Bet, the author, is like, wait a second, you're CIA? Yeah, that's right. I'm CIA. Wait, you're really CIA? She says, look, I'll try and make this brief. After your experience in New York City, Central Office believed you would be the perfect candidate to become a psychedelic guru. The CIA recruited Ken Casey in the 60s, but now we need a new model. Queer and female and presenting for the new era. Like Casey, you are very smart, but insecure and also gullible and self-absorbed, privileged, and with time on your hands, the perfect choice for our next cult leader. At first, it will be data collecting, and then we'll move on to the phase where you will lead a sizable portion of the population into the food stalls to be eaten by the lizard kings. Don't worry, they won't actually die. It's just their chi that will be eaten.
Is this woman having a stroke?
And she's looking at her friend Rosie going, I thought MK Ultra was done decades ago. And she says, look, it did, but that's just what the mainstream understands. Now we've moved on to the new project, which is called Project Lamb Chop. So she asks what being a cult leader will entail, and basically Rosie says she has to activate the charisma grid in New York City and personality disorders and narcissism will be activated, and she has no choice. She basically has to do this.
But narcissism and personality disorders are not good things. Why would they be activated?
Well, the CIA agents is basically blackmailing her, saying, look, I know when you're having these psychedelic trips and having astral sex with the multi-gendered, opalescent interdimensional beings, which we never hear about, by the way, Central Office wants to channel your eros into a new psychedelic revolution. And the final pitch from her friend Rosie is, think about what you could do for feminism. And she's like, I don't want to become a sociopath for feminism. And she's like, nothing will drive all your enemies more insane than you becoming a psychedelic cult leader. Project Lamb Chop will make sure the souls of all your enemies will be fed to the lizard beings, so don't feel bad about it. And I'm just like, yeah, the new guru. But who is this Rosie character? So eventually, Rosie admits, after she talks about being a CIA operative, she opens up to Bet and reveals that she tried to commit suicide by eating baker's chocolate. And she explains that it was probably a mental command from Project Lamb Chop, but that it's at that point that I realized Rosie is her dog. and she's been having this conversation with her dog the whole time.
If there ever was a warning as to why you should probably not take these things, this is it.
Stunning and brave.
Look, I mean, I was actually thinking about it because we have over the years done, we've had a lot of discussion about, the scientific discoveries about psilocybin and magic mushrooms and what they can do. And there does seem to be a lot of hope. But this is a really good example of we talk about shamanism. There's wisdom that comes through the use of these substances because there's tradition behind them. Whereas if you're just going to go and take things willy-nilly and end up talking to your dog and Project Lamb Chop.
Yeah, it's funny because there was a complete disconnect between the reviews and all the blurbs I was reading and what actually happened in the book.
Did no one read the actual book? Is that?
Oh, no, I'm sure they did. But it's this kind of stuff that is considered it's because it's raw.
It's not
It's because it's raw,
crazy.
Raw and honest. But I'm like, no one's going to take, psilocybin very seriously if your book is about all your failed lesbian relationships and talking to your dog about MK Ultra. It's fun. It's super fun. Not up to the level of Dale McLeod's book, by the way.
Well, she hasn't flashed her lady bits at her mother. So.
There's no vagina flashing in it. Well, there's actually there's quite a lot of vagina flashing in this. There's quite a lot, actually. I take that back. There's a lot. 10 times more. I might be being a bit hard on this book, but maybe it's just because I was spoilt by Dale McLeod's The Big Dream book, which we still highly recommend. And I went into this thinking it was something that it isn't. It's still very fun. If you do this kind of very personal story, and talking about her experiences, not going to great detail, but just a very kind of long, almost like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas in the term of this woman's life. It's that kind of book.
But to be serious, if she's been taking psilocybin, it doesn't seem like her life is getting better. It doesn't seem like the intelligence is pushing her in a better direction. It sounds like she's becoming, not psychotic, but
well, I haven't finished the whole thing,
borderline.
But just skipping forward, eventually she gets arrested, and I think the FBI gets her for possession or something.
Of psilocybin?
Yeah, of psilocybin.
That's not
long, drawn-out kind of fight with the law, and it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
There's just not the wisdom.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what was in the weeds. I wanted to know what the bushes were saying when they were talking to her. I don't really care what her dog thinks about MK Ultra.
And tries to commit suicide by eating too much Baker's chocolate.
I do care what rocks think about fashion, though.
Well.
That's important. Well, let's take a break here because that was kind of the end of my thread. And I realized I needed to pick up another thread to finish this show. So when we come back from the break, I'm going to share with you some experiences I've been having with acupuncture lately and some odd stories that have come out of that. And ultimately, this leads us to the butterfly people of Missouri. That's coming up after this on Mysterious Universe. Stay with us. We're back on Mysterious Universe, and this kind of rarely happens these days where I get to the end of the story and I'm like, oh, well, that went nowhere. So I had a couple of new leads to follow. I mentioned before the break that I've been seeing a new acupuncturist here on the Sunshine Coast. Her name's Patricia Cowell. She's fantastic. I think she's the best practitioner I've ever seen. If you're on the Sunshine Coast here in Queensland and you want to go see someone, a Chinese medicine practitioner, look her up. patriciacowell.com.au is her website. But she is a specialist in herbs, but she's also very good at pulse diagnosis.
Yeah, you were telling me about this because you said that she somehow picked up that you'd had like a sore throat or something a few days earlier. Yeah. How could you do that?
Just this
from your pulse.
Chinese magic.
Yeah.
She sits down, she puts just her left hand on my pulse with three fingers, the way they do that with three fingers. And she's just chatting to me and, taking notes on what she's feeling in my pulse. It's like she's barely paying attention to my pulse. And she just says, oh, your pulse is telling me you've had a sore throat in the last couple of days. And at first I was like, no. But then I remembered it was precisely 2 days earlier. I'd woken up in the morning and my throat was really sore. And then it just kind of went away. But the fact that she picked that up for feeling my pulse for 30 seconds.
Oh, it's incredible.
It's like some weird magic.
Yeah.
And then a couple of weeks later, she did it again. I had an issue with my ear or something, and which is kind of still there, by the way. But she managed to pick that up as well. She says, oh, yeah, by the way, what's going on, with your throat and your ear? And she just picks it up from your pulse. But anyway, while I was chatting with her, she'd already asked what I'd do when I told her about Mysterious Universe. So she was kind of keeping an ear out for stories for me. And she has a friend who claims to be a little bit psychic, and a friend is working on this new art project. And a friend was painting all these butterfly people. And when Patricia asked her about it, her friend explained, oh, these are the butterfly people of Missouri. And she asked me if I'd heard about it, and it kind of rung a bell, but I couldn't quite remember the details of the story. So while I was in the office with her in the room, I got out my phone and I just quickly Googled it, and the first result is Mysterious Universe, Brent Swanson. I said, oh, you mean these butterfly people? And she says, oh, you must have heard of it. I haven't actually read the article from Brent, but it's got to do with the town of Joplin in Missouri and the incredible tornado that went through there on May the 22nd, 2011, this catastrophic EF5 rated multiple vortex tornado. This thing was unbelievable. At one point, it was a mile across. The winds were up to 200 miles per hour, and it basically obliterated the city. Like if you look at the satellite view of the before and after,
it
looks like a bomb's been dropped. Like everything is flattened. $2.8 billion in damage. 161 people lost their lives. 1,000 more were injured. Seventh deadliest tornado in US history. And there were incredible stories of survival and death, of course. There was like a toddler snatched from his mother's arms as the wind came through. There was a teenager that was sucked up out of the top of the sunroof on an SUV. Houses exploding in the wind. It was terrible.
Did the kids survive?
No.
Oh, that's awful.
But for months after the disaster, stories started to filter out about butterfly people. And there were all these accounts. They were always from children, but there were all these accounts from surviving children who said they were protected by butterfly people. So one popular account, Brent writes, that probably made the name stick came from this 2.5-year-old little girl. She was in a car with her father when the tornado came through. And miraculously, although the vehicle was blown clear off the road and tumbled over, the two occupants, they were shaken, but they were completely unharmed. But the girl would later say that the butterfly people had been sitting in the car with them. And when she was told that no one else had been in the car, she insisted. She says, no, Daddy, there were butterfly people in the car with us. And these stories just kept on coming out. There was another vehicular encounter that allegedly happened when a young boy was riding in a truck with his father, and a car came soaring over the air towards them, almost like it was just going to land on top of them like a direct collision. And it somehow just kind of veered off course before it smashed into them. Now, the boy would later say that he had seen two very big angels hold the car back at the time and throw it to the side. Now, only the boy had seen these figures, but apparently the father said later, like the way that the car moved in the air seemed paranormal. There seemed something odd about it. There's an account of a mother and her young daughter who were also caught in the tornado in their car. They managed to crawl out of the vehicle and take refuge in a nearby ditch, but the tornado was heading straight to them. Everything in its path just getting completely obliterated. And amazingly, it went past them and they were fine. They couldn't understand what had happened. They didn't get lifted into the air. They didn't get smashed by debris. They were fine. And afterwards, according to the report, the girl said to her mother, weren't they beautiful, Mum? Didn't you see how beautiful their wings were? Now, when the mother asked her daughter what she was talking about, because there was no one else there, the girl insisted they'd been surrounded by winged people with rainbow-coloured wings.
So what they're describing, they're saying winged people, are they essentially describing angels? I mean, I know children are calling them butterfly people, but it sounds like they're, and in the capacity of what they're doing, it sounds like angels.
It's a funny one because a lot of the kids are very adamant about butterfly people. So there must have been something about the wings that made them look more like butterflies. Because this is an area that is predominantly Christian. I mean, a lot of the kids go to Sunday school. They know what angels are.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
It's just strange that they would say butterfly people.
It sounds very Keelian in a way.
Yeah, it does.
You know, like with Mothman, and even though, you know, obviously Mothman didn't seem to save people, but Mothman did show up around the time of a disaster. It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah. There's a bunch of accounts. There's a kid who was 5 years old, and he was caught outdoors when the tornado came through. Again, devastation everywhere all around him, but he's just fine, like not a scratch on the kid. And he would later claim that as the winds were going crazy around him, he had seen 3 figures with butterfly wings walking towards him across the field. And wherever they stood, the debris would kind of bounce off them like there was some invisible force field. And he claims these 3 winged entities surrounded him until the tornado passed. They were smiling as they were doing this, but then vanished into thin air once everything was cleared. And there's a great story of a deputy sheriff who told a similar tale. There was a 4-year-old boy who was found wandering about a field in the aftermath, and when he was asked where he had come from, he'd actually been in the St. John's Hospital. He'd been inside the hospital when the tornado struck, but he was completely unharmed. He didn't have a scratch on him, and the hospital was almost flattened, like the hospital was almost destroyed. And when asked how on earth he had gotten from the hospital to the field without an injury, he simply stated, "Oh, the angels brought me here and put me down." There's tons of these. There's tons of these where the father's, you know, kind of all beat up and his shoes got ripped off and he's completely like bloodied and broken arm, and his kid is just fine and totally unscathed. And the kid's like, "Dad, how come the butterfly people didn't protect you?" And he's, "I don't know, son."
It is unusual though that it seems like it's related just to children. Are there no adult cases at all?
According to the reports, no child over 12 years old had a story to tell. The final one I've got here, there was a kid whose family was fine because they managed to get into a shelter, but the kid wasn't fast enough and he was caught outside. And when the tornado had passed, the family came out of the shelter and it was just, you know, you can imagine like devastation, the house destroyed, debris everywhere. And they were calling out his name. They just couldn't find him. And they came across, like hundreds of meters away, they came across a green rug, which they'd never seen before, which looked pristine, like it looked brand new. And it's rolled up and he's inside it. The kid is inside it like a burrito. He's been rolled up in this green blanket. And when they asked him who wrapped him up in the blanket, he said the butterfly people. That's a great story, I think, being wrapped up in a green blanket. It's like Indiana Jones jumping inside a fridge to protect himself from the atomic explosion.
I was just trying to think about it. I'm thinking, well, it's like, it's just carpet, though. It's not going to protect him.
I'm pretty sure you'd get
flying debris.
You'd get messed up if you were wrapped up in a blanket.
Yeah.
In a tornado. Like when you've flown up into the air 200 meters and you dropped, I don't think being inside a blanket like a burrito is going to protect you. But the kid was fine because the butterfly people protected him. So nearly everyone, Brent writes, who was there has heard some miraculous tale of butterfly people. It has become such an ongoing phenomenon that a mural called Butterfly Effect, Dreams Take Flight, was commissioned to the muralist Dave Lowenstein, and it's actually erected in the city downtown. So maybe, Aaron, if you can find that one, we can put it in the show notes. But the question I had was this, which is a pretty obvious one. Are these just urban legends? You know, is there any truth to this? Have any eyewitnesses actually gone on record? Do we have a kid, you know, in front of a camera going, "Yeah, I saw the butterfly people"? As far as I could tell, no. As much as I could find out on this, it's mostly word of mouth. It's mostly people saying they heard someone else tell this story rather than, "Oh, I know someone directly who experienced this."
But that's the problem, funnily enough, with this modern type of phenomena. You know, those boots on the ground researchers really are not out there as much as they used to be back, you know, in the 50s and 60s, even the 1970s. And so unfortunately, you don't have people going into these locations and actually speaking to eyewitnesses about their experiences.
Well,
you just don't get it.
You're right, but I did find a local author who reached out to survivors for interviews. She wrote a book. It's called The Devil Came to Town and the Angels Followed. Her name is Bonnie Hoag Peterson. But she does go on to say in the intro, however, that the people she spoke to, some of them had accounts, but they didn't want to go on record. And most of them always had just heard them from a cousin or a friend of a friend. And she added that not all the storylines in her book are real. Some of them are composites that she'd heard or read about, and she'd kind of joined them all into a story for her book. So even her book, although it's labeled nonfiction, it's not all nonfiction. But she did say that a good number of children, none over the age of 12, did tell various adults about their experiences with angels or butterfly people. She said this has been documented by teachers, ministers, parents, counselors, and a host of others. One anonymous individual estimated to me that as many as 80 stories have come to light. That some might have been reported more than once is certainly possible, but what is difficult to reconcile, however, are the similarities recounted by the children. And these do stand out, like the swiftness with which the beings appear. They're just suddenly there at this critical moment, and then they're gone, they're vanished. The other feature is obviously the large wings that are described. But many of the children reported that the entities were bright or they glowed in some fashion. Some reported feeling a light, gentle touch and then looking up and seeing the beings around them, and they were comforted and protected. So, yeah, again, there's such common knowledge in this town that there's the mural and everyone knows about them.
But that stuff's really important. And this is why, when you're doing this critical analysis of these sorts of stories and events, is that you do have to look at the similarities in what children are reporting. Now, if it's early on and these children aren't hearing these stories from other people, because there's always that risk that a child is just repeating what they've heard. But if these are first-hand reports that are very fresh or very new, then, children have very, extremely varied imaginations. If they're going to say that they were saved by something, kids are going to go all the way from the full spectrum of, pink dragons all the way up to God knows what. They're not going to be describing very similar attributes unless they're all seeing something similar.
That's why it's important that these people go on the record.
Absolutely.
If they're real accounts, they should be on the record. They shouldn't just be on internet sites.
Yeah, I know.
Well, they should be, but there should be real names behind them, and you can actually verify that they've actually been experienced.
But you just said it there, that they were reluctant to go on record. And I wonder if things have changed. Because in the past, again, we're going back decades, but there was this fear of ridicule, and this is why people wouldn't talk about their experiences. But I would have hoped that as we've moved into the 2000s, that people are less worried about ridicule, especially with the, it's your truth. Well, it's like, I actually saw a butterfly person. Like, why are people so reluctant to go on record about their experiences?
Well, it might just be the case that no one's looked into it. If it was the John Keel era, Keel and another 5 different researchers would be down there.
Yeah.
But we're not in the Keel era. So there was plenty of reporting on the people that died and the very brave stories of people that risked their lives to save others, all that stuff. But I'm not sure if anyone really put boots on the ground and tried to find out more about these stories. So for the moment, it's still kind of in urban legend territory.
It's probably too long now as well.
Yeah.
Because obviously the other thing that happens with these kids, when did you say it was? 2012?
2011.
2011. Okay. So, 9 years has passed. It's a long time for a child. Most of those kids, you said none of them were over 12.
Yeah.
They're all adults now.
The memories would have faded for sure. So the thing, though, that pops up with this is obviously the guardian angels theme. So that was the obvious thread to pull on for this story.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe I can find more reports of guardian angels. Like if I actually look into that genre, maybe there's more reports where someone says, oh, they kind of had butterfly-like wings or they were shiny. Some of the kids actually said they looked wet, like they had a wet look to them, which I guess is just
like a slickly kind of...
just shiny.
Mm.
So I managed to grab a copy of Proof of Angels, the definitive book on the reality of angels and the surprising role they play in each of our lives. It's by Ptolemy Tompkins and Tyler Beddoes. I got as far as the introduction. And not because I have...
You've had a good day.
Not because I have Bible fatigue, which I also have Bible fatigue. Because that's all we've been talking about for like the last 3 shows.
That's what happened, unfortunately, when I started looking into the ancient nuclear weapons, is I had to stop for a moment because it was talking about the destruction of, was it...
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah. So I was like, look... I don't have anything against it, but I've just got a bit of fatigue. I'm going to take a break.
Well, it was funny the other day in the office, I'd come in the morning and was opening a package that I'd just gotten delivered. And you would kind of walk down the stairs and said, oh, yeah, we've been doing so much Bible content. The last 2 shows were huge, and it was all the kind of Bible conspiracy stuff, the history stuff. What are we going to do next? And I just opened the package, and it was a children's Bible I'd ordered for my son, like with all the pictures and everything. It's just the perfect timing.
Perfect timing, yeah.
You're like,
I was like, great, sure, we'll do that.
But in this introduction of the book, I didn't stop because I have Bible fatigue. I stopped because the authors mentioned in that introduction a story that inspired them to write that book. And I was so tempted to try and find it because the story sounded so amazing. I had to do it. And it's from Howard Storm. It's called My Descent into Death, A Second Chance at Life. And Storm is he's an art teacher. And the story begins with him in Paris. He's traveling with his wife and a bunch of art students. And he's in his hotel room, and they're basically on their last day in Paris, or their second last day, and they're planning what they're going to do on their last day before they head off to, I think, Amsterdam they were going to next. And while he's sitting there in the hotel room, a feeling of nausea just rips through him. And a few times on this trip, he's had, stomach problems. He's had a bit of indigestion, and he's had to take, antacid and aspirin tablets. But now with this feeling, he takes 2 aspirin, he washes them down, he tries to ignore this feeling and goes on and keeps talking about their plans for the next day. And as he's talking to his students, this pain rips through his stomach and he feels like he's been shot. Now, he says it was just absolutely searing. He drops to his knees, he collapses on the floor, and he's holding his gut, screaming in pain. He said something terrifying was happening inside me. I didn't know what it was. And I was surprised that there was no wound. Like, he was looking for blood. He was looking for the entry wound. And while he's kind of rocking back and forth in pain, he looks up to the window in the hotel room because he expects to see shattered glass from where the bullet came in. But there's nothing. And as he's collapsed on the ground, he's kind of in agony and he screams out to his wife. He says, call the doctor, call the doctor. Now, the hotel calls a doctor, and 10 minutes later, a doctor arrives, starts probing Howard's abdomen, and it's a perforation in his duodenum.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right down there. There's a hole in the important bits. And it is just a searing pain. And he asks the doctor, look, what can I do about this? And the doctor says, you need an operation immediately or you're going to die. So, okay, they call an ambulance for him. He rushes off and gets a consulting x-ray. He's at one of the largest public hospitals in Paris. They tell him, look, it might be an ulcer or a foreign object, but you've got this large hole down there. And yeah, you need an operation immediately or you're going to die. So following the examination in the emergency department, he's taken by gurney to the emergency building. It's a couple of blocks away. And this is where the surgery is going to be performed. And the whole time, like, the doctor gave him morphine, but it's wearing off. And the whole time it is just getting worse and worse and worse. And he's left in this room and minutes stretch into hours. No doctor comes. Whenever a nurse enters the room, he's begging for more morphine, but there's nothing they can do. And by the early afternoon, the morphine he'd been given had completely worn off, and this fiery pain is just getting worse and worse and worse. Like, his stomach feels like it's full of burning coals. He's getting hot flashes and intense, stabs in his arms and legs. And he keeps repeating in French that he's dying and begging for help. But the problem is, it's the weekend. And the public system at the time, I think this was 1985, I don't know what it's like now, but at the time, they were incredibly understaffed. There was one surgeon on for the entire hospital. And apparently this guy was the only one that could approve the right kind of drugs that he needed. And he was busy with something else. So that he was just dying.
It sounds like he's going into sepsis or something.
Yeah, he's dying in this hospital. Minute by minute, second by second, the time passed into hours. And by 8 o'clock that night, the pain was unbearable. He'd been in the same bed, in the same position, in the same room since noon without seeing a doctor. And the pain wasn't in waves anymore. It was just constant. He said the hydrochloric acid leaking from his stomach was spreading throughout his abdominal cavity, literally eating him up from the inside. The searing torment was gaining strength and he was getting weaker. Breathing was almost impossible. Basically, he had to put all his remaining energy into just breathing. And he kept thinking to himself, this isn't how it's supposed to end. Like, what's going to happen to my wife? What's going to happen to my children? What's going to happen to my career, my paintings, my house, my gardens, all the things I have? He was only 38 years old, and he was just starting to achieve something as an artist. He was starting to get better known. Yeah, recognition for his work. He said, how could all my work and struggle have come to this? And his wife looked totally drained, emotionally exhausted. And he didn't want to tell her that he knew he wasn't going to be able to hold on much longer. Now, he said he was later told by American doctors that as soon as the perforation occurs, life expectancy is about 5 hours. So he's like 3 hours beyond that now. And eventually at about 9 o'clock p.m., finally one of the nurses comes into his hospital room and she says, oh, sorry, the doctor has gone home. He wants to do the operation tomorrow morning. He's like, shit.
Au revoir.
Yeah, basically that was it. He just needed to go home for a baguette. Come back in the morning.
Baguette and a cigarette.
Now, Howard basically knows he's not going to survive. 10 hours had passed since the hole in his stomach had erupted, and he had no energy left to keep breathing anymore. So he turns to his wife and, fighting against the flood of tears, he basically tells her that he loves her so much, but it's over. And he says goodbye. She says goodbye back because she knows what's happening as well. They kiss each other and she collapses in the chair, just completely overcome with grief. And he starts saying to himself, let it end now, because dying is kind of easy compared to this pain. Like, he knows that he can let go. And he says, I knew what would happen next. It would be the end of my consciousness, the end of my existence. I knew that to be true, he said. The idea of any kind of life after death never entered my mind because I didn't believe in that kind of nonsense. He said, I knew for certain that there was no such thing. Only simple-minded people believed in that sort of thing. I didn't believe in God. I didn't believe in heaven or hell or any other fairy tales. I would just drift into darkness, drift into sleep, drift into annihilation. Suddenly, he's standing up in the room and immediately thinks, okay, this has got to be a dream, because he feels more alert, more aware, and more alive than he's ever felt in his life. This is what I was talking about earlier with the mushroom experience, the God experience that Bet was describing. This is exactly what Howard is going through. His senses are extremely vivid. Everything around him and himself is alive. The linoleum tiles of the floor, he can feel the slick coolness against his feet. They're kind of clammy. The bright light of the room illuminates everything in not 4K, 8K clarity.
Are the curtains insulting his clothing?
Yeah, the curtains are like, that jacket is obscene.
Well, look, we have to ask the question, is he out of his body?
Obviously. Yeah, obviously. I mean, we know these stories. He goes through the usual shock. Everything is heightened, like the sounds of everything. The surface of his skin is tingling with sensations. And it's weird, like he kind of pinches himself and it hurts. This is what's so confusing. This is no dream, he says.
The physical non-physicality.
I'm more alive than I've ever been before. Now, he's mildly aware of the problem in his stomach, but it's more of a memory of a pain than pain itself. And he's squeezing his fists and just feeling the skin, and everything is real. Now, he tries to speak to his wife, and she's being very rude. She's not answering him at all, just totally ignoring him. And she eventually is yelling at her, just yelling for attention. But eventually he notices that there's something in between them in the bed. There's some kind of weird object in the bed. And it's funny the way he describes it, because he leans over and he says there's like this hideous clone of him in the bed, and it's some kind of like shallow, gross husk that's in there, and he's really confused by it. He says it looked by like my face, but it was meaningless, empty and lifeless, just a slab of meat, but everything else was vividly clear. And he's like, what the hell is happening to me? This is so real. How can this be? And crazy thoughts start running through his mind. Like, he starts running through this conspiracy of how he must have passed out and the hospital has made a wax dummy of him and put it in the bed. Like it's some kind of weird French prank. But no, obviously we know what's going on. But the story gets really interesting when outside the room in the hall, he hears voices calling his name. Howard, Howard. And they're pleasant voices. There's a male and a female, a young voice and an old voice, but they're calling him in English. And he finds this very strange because no one in the hospital speaks English. Everyone just speaks French. And he's really confused. These voices are saying, come on out here, Howard. Let's go. Hurry up. We've been waiting for you for a long time. Come out. He's like, I can't. I'm sick. Something's the matter with me. Something's wrong in here. I need an operation. I'm very sick. We can get you fixed up, Howard, if you hurry up. Don't you want to get better? Don't you want help? Now, he's in this unknown hospital. He's in a foreign country. He's in this bizarre situation. He has no idea what's going on. And he's actually afraid of these people calling him. He said they were irritated by my questions, which were only attempts to find out who they were. And he said the hallway looked strange as I moved closer to the door. And he said he had a feeling that if he left the hospital room, it might be impossible to get back in. But the voices continued to plead with him. We can't help you if you don't come out, Howard. Come out of the room. Now, after more unanswered questions, he said, I assumed they must be here to take me to an operation. Who else could they be? They're obviously doctors and they want to help me. So he decides to follow them. He crosses the threshold. He enters the hall because, again, he needed surgery. He knew he needed surgery. But as he steps into the hall, everything's hazy. It's like a bad TV reception. It's kind of like being in a plane and you're flying through clouds. Like you can't see anything else. And the people that were calling him, they were off in the distance and he couldn't see them very clearly. He could tell they were male and female, tall and short, old and young adults. He said their clothes were grey and pale. And he starts to move closer to them to try and identify them. But as he does this, they quickly withdraw deeper into this fog. So he has to follow further and further into this weird, thick atmosphere. Now, he could never get closer than 10 feet. They were always 10 feet ahead. And he just starts thinking, who are these people? What do they want? Where do they want me to go? And what was the matter with my wife? Why was she ignoring me? But they wouldn't answer anything. Their only response was to insist that he hurry up and follow them. Now, they told him repeatedly that his problems were meaningless and unnecessary. So he just keeps following them. He's shuffling along in his bare feet and he's getting sweaty with perspiration. He's confused, but not tired at all. And he knew, again, that he had this problem that had to be operated on. And these entities ahead, these people, appeared to be his only hope. Now, every time he hesitates and stops, they demand that he keeps up. And they continue to repeat the promise that if he follows them, his troubles will end. And they just keep insisting, we've got to get to our destination. Come on, Howard, don't stop. Now, during this journey, he can see entities all around him, like sometimes off in the distance, and he can never quite make out the details of them, never quite see their faces. But as he keeps walking, he tries to count them, and he can't keep track of the numbers. And eventually, they're getting so numerous, it would be impossible to count them. Now, he also has no idea of what direction they're traveling. It feels like miles too, like they've been walking for miles and miles and miles. And he starts thinking,
how big is this hospital?
Yeah, how can I still be in this hospital? But there's also this weird effect where he can turn around and still see in the distance the door to his hospital room. And it's all bright and lit. And he can see his wife sitting there and he can even see his body still lying in the bed. And he just doesn't know what to do, but the door is getting further and further away. Now, all the while they were walking, he's trying to pick up clues as to where they're going by what they were walking on. Now, there's no walls of any kind, and the floor has no features. There's no incline or decline. It's like a smooth, slightly damp, cool floor.
Damp?
It's slightly damp. But he said sometimes there was a strange feeling that we might be subtly descending. And there was a profound sense of timelessness too. Like he's usually pretty good at counting time, keeping track of time, because he's an art lecturer and he, lectures for an hour and then has to stop the class. But this time he couldn't keep track of it. It was just totally, it could have been years, it could have been days, it could have been minutes. He finally slowed down and he said to the beings ahead, "Look, I'm sick. I can't do this." And they became really angry and sarcastic. "If you'd quit your moaning and groaning, we'd get there. Move it. Let's go. Hurry up." The more questioning and suspicious he became, the more antagonistic and authoritarian they became. And he started to hear whispering about his butt because he still had the hospital gown on. And
So they could see his butt.
They could hear this whispering about his ass and about how pathetic he was. And he knew they were talking about him. But when he tried to hear exactly what they were saying, or they'll say, what was that? He would hear them whisper to each other and they would say stuff like, "Shh, he can hear you, shh." And what was increasingly clear to him is that, and obviously, they're deceiving him. The longer he stayed with them, the further away his escape would be. And eventually got to the point where they started shouting and hurling insults at him, demanding that he hurry along. And the more miserable he became, the more enjoyment they got from his distress. And there's this sense of dread just growing with him. And this experience is too real. It's not a dream. It's not a hallucination. It's realer than real life. And he's frightened, exhausted, cold, and lost. And it's clear that the help these terrible beings had first promised was a trick. It was a ruse to get him to follow them.
This is not going in the direction that I expected. And it does fall into line, though, with some theories I've heard out there that, you know, they're at the extremes of what I think is possible. Because normally when you hear a near-death experience, for the most part, apart from people that describe, you know, having hellish encounters, they're very rare. But for the most part, it's like you connect with passed-on loved ones and it's very comfortably. There's been
tunnel of light.
Yeah, exactly.
Jesus turns up. Yeah.
There's been some suggestions that there are beings that prey on people at the point of death. And this sounds to be one of the first examples I've heard of that.
Well, any hesitation he has is now instilling abuse and insults thrown at him. And that he's just basically told to shut up, just take a few more steps. You're almost there, you pathetic loser.
So you have to cross the threshold. You have to do it willingly.
Yeah.
They can't
go in and take him.
Yeah.
He had to come out and follow them. And he says a few of the voices he hears, because there's beings everywhere now, a few of the voices offer almost a friendly conciliatory tone, but it's still sarcastic. And whenever he hears those types of voices, there's all this laughter, like it's some kind of big joke. He hears this laughter ripple through the other entities.
That's amazing. I've actually got a story that I just happened to come across today when I was looking for stuff from this particular region of Ohio that kind of matches this.
Really?
Yeah, in a really strange way. It might give us some, insight into the missing 411 phenomenon.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
He says the feeling, the mood with all these entities, the feeling in the air is like triumph and excitement. Like,
so they've got one.
We've got him.
Yeah.
Here we go. And for a long time, he said, I'd been walking with my gaze down because he was watching his step, looking at his feet. But suddenly he looks up and he's horrified to discover he's in complete darkness. Can't see a thing. And the hopelessness of the situation overwhelms him. It's like mentally he starts to crack. Mentally, this is it. Like he realizes how bad the situation is and he tells them he can't go any further. He says, leave me alone. I know you're lying to me. And he starts to feel their breath on his body in the darkness. And they're now shouting at him and snarling insults. And they actually start to attack him. They're pushing him and shoving him in the darkness. And he starts to fight back. He said a wild frenzy of taunting, screaming, and hitting ensues. And he fights like a wild man. He actually fights for his life. And as he's swinging and kicking at them, they're biting him and tearing back at him. And all the while this is happening, it's obvious that they're loving it. This is fun. Even though he can't see anything in the darkness, he's aware that there's dozens or perhaps even hundreds of them all around, all over him. He said, my attempts to fight back only provoked greater merriment. As I continued to defend myself, I was aware that they weren't in any hurry to finish me. They were playing with me just as a cat plays with a mouse. Every new assault brought howls of cacophonous laughter. They began to tear off pieces of my flesh. To my horror, I realized that I was being taken apart and eaten alive, methodically and slowly, so that their entertainment would last as long as possible. Now, at one point, in this kind of hellish experience, he realized that these creatures, they were once human beings. And he says the best way he can describe them is to think of the worst imaginable person stripped of every impulse of compassion and benevolence. Some of them seemed to be able to tell others what to do, but he had no sense that they were organized anyway. It was just like a mob. They didn't appear directed by anyone. They were just a mob driven by cruelty. And he said in that darkness, he had intense physical contact with them. Like they're jumping on him, swarming all over him, punching him, kicking him, bumping into him. And he said their bodies felt like human bodies. They were like human bodies, except for two characteristics. Number one, they had very long, sharp fingernails. Number two, their teeth were longer than normal. He said, I'd never been bitten by a human being before this. Now, during this struggle, it's obviously terrifying. It's the indescribably horrible experience, but he can't feel any pain. He says that they don't appear to possess any special abilities. It's like they're feeding off his fear and misery. That's what they're getting out of it. And
it's like shadow people.
Yeah, he said the level of noise was excruciating. The people laughing, yelling, and jeering. I was the object of their desire. My torment was their excitement, and the more I fought, the greater their thrill. And eventually, he was so torn up, like there was so much flesh torn from his body, and he was just a mess. He gave up. He was too broken to resist. And then they basically stopped tormenting him because he wasn't fun to torment anymore. He wasn't amusing. It's like their prey had given up. He'd been torn apart, and he was just lying there in the darkness.
But I wonder what would have happened if he crossed. Is there a barrier to cross into? Would he have gone into their domain, or did they get what they wanted? They just wanted to terrify him.
He says he can't actually say everything that happened. It's too disturbing, and there's some things he doesn't want to remember. Like he can't actually go back to them to recall them because they're too damaging. A lot of the details he's just blocked out, and he's been traumatized by what happened for years. But he was totally alone in this dark space. And a few of them were still kind of snarling around him, but the general mob had gone. A couple of them were still like taking little pieces, like the scraps. And but he couldn't really resist. He was just broken. And as he lay there on the ground, he said a voice emerged from his chest. It sounded like his voice, but it wasn't his thought. Like it didn't come from him. And the voice said, pray. And he's like, he remembers thinking, what a stupid idea. That doesn't work. I'm lying here in this darkness surrounded by hideous creatures and I don't believe in God. What's praying going to do? I don't believe. I don't pray, period. It's not going to do anything. And then the second time as he's lying there, this voice says, pray. And he's like, I don't know how to pray. I haven't prayed any time in my adult life. I don't know how. But the voice comes again and says, pray. This time it's more definite. Now he says, praying for me as a child had been something I watched adults do occasionally. It was something fancy. You had to do it perfectly. Like it was some kind of formula. That's how he thought of it. And it was something he memorized. So he actually tried really hard to think of something from his childhood, like some kind of memory. And he ended up doing this kind of jumbled Star-Spangled Banner, Lord's Prayer, Pledge of Allegiance. Like what came out was, yea, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. For purple mountain majesty, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Deliver us from evil. One nation under God. God bless America. Play ball. Just this mess comes out. And to his amazement, the beings are incited with rage with this ridiculous sentence he's just uttered. He said it was as if he threw boiling oil on them. They're like, yeah! And they get really angry and start screaming at him. There's no God. How dare you? Nobody can hear you. You're stuck here forever.
Is he in Portland?
Seattle.
Oh, right. Okay, right.
No, he's just completely harassed by these beings now. They're filled with rage all over again. But at the same time, he says they're backing away. He said, I could still hear their voices in the utter darkness, but they were getting more and more distant. He said, I realized that saying things about God was actually driving them away. I became a little more forceful with what I was saying. He says, leave me alone. The Lord is my shepherd.
I'd just be citing lines from The Exorcist. The power of Christ compels you.
Yeah, you just think of all those movies. One nation under God, he says. He just comes up with all these things. Now, they start retreating and they're far away. He feels like they're in the periphery of wherever he is. But he also understands they can come back at any moment. Like this ruse isn't going to last long. And he's alone, destroyed, but painfully alive. Like he's painfully alive. And at first, he said when he was walking with these people, he had thought they were in some foggy part of the hospital. But now he realized that I'm not even in the world anymore. How could this be the world? I'm somewhere else entirely. Now he starts thinking about his life. He starts having this kind of mini life review. And he realizes that he's been selfish his entire life. He's always put his own desires in front of his family, in front of others. He's always, strove really hard for fame and material things. And he said, I hadn't had time for many friends. I was too busy. As a matter of fact, I found most people to be tiresome, some kind of nuisance. And I did what I could to avoid social interactions. I didn't belong to any clubs or organizations. And in spite of my narcissistic appearance, I didn't like myself and I didn't like other people either. He said how ironic it was to end up in the sewer of the universe with people who fed off the pain of others. He said it dawned on me that I was not unlike these miserable creatures that had tormented me. But he didn't believe in life after death. When you died, it's like a switch going off, just blank, nothing. That was it, the end of your existence. But now he was in this darkness beyond life, and it was hell. And he actually realized that.
So he thinks this actually is hell, like literal hell? Like it wasn't a hellish experience?
He starts to understand because there's a part of him that's holding on, but it's slipping. Like there's a part of his psyche that is giving up. And he realizes that when that goes, he's going to become one of them. He will be those creatures, and he will be just filled with hatred and torment. And he's completely lost, lying there, torn apart. And all of a sudden, this tune from his childhood starts playing through his head. And the tune is sung in his voice of when he was 4 or 5 years old, or whenever he heard this tune. And it's the voice of a child that's full of innocence, full of trust and hope. And it's some kind of religious song. It's some kind of Jesus loves me, da, 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 da. Like, did you ever have one of those songs that was like some kind of Christian earworm when you were young?
No, I wasn't exposed to much, so no.
Yeah, neither was I, but there was an ad that was on TV where I used to live when we grew up. And it was always on, like the sneaky Christians would put it on during cartoon hour. Like in Saturday morning cartoon hour, they'd sneak in this Jesus ad. And we used to make fun of it at school all the time because it was the most pathetic, it was the most pathetic thing you've ever seen. It's basically a kid who is so sad and he's alone on a swing by himself and no one will push him. And the song, I remember it so clearly. Like if I was trapped in a dark dimension of hell with all these demons, this is the song that would come to my mind. It was basically, I need a friend, Lord Jesus, won't you be my friend?
Oh, that would push me in the opposite direction.
It was so lame. And we used to tease other kids with it at school. Like it actually had the opposite effect. Like if one of us got detention or something, we'd wait at the door and be like, I need a friend. You would sing it. You would sing it to people just to piss them off. We used to tease people with it all the time. But I remember that. So I imagine that kind of earworm is what's going through his head. And he says, look, I don't have a theological interest in it. He said it was simply a spontaneous recollection from some random day at Sunday school. And all of a sudden, with all the strength he had left, for some reason he yells out into the darkness, Jesus, save me. He just screams it out with the core of his being. He said, I've never meant anything more strongly in my life. And all of a sudden there's this... there's this light in the darkness, like this weird orb.
Godzilla Jesus shows up.
Yeah, this weird orb starts rapidly floating towards him, getting brighter and brighter and brighter until he realizes it's not something. It's 8 foot tall light Jesus. Now, remember I said at the start of this I had Bible fatigue?
Yeah.
I did not know this was going to be in the story.
Well, the problem with stories like this, and I don't want to, completely dismiss them, obviously, but there's a small part of you that thinks, is this some type of, like, join my church because I got saved by Jesus kind of story? Or did you actually genuinely have this experience?
Yeah, I mean, you always have those questions. Like, I'm yet to find the story where there's an Indian guy trapped in the bottom depths of hell and Ganesh shows up.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be probably easier for the Indian gods because they have multiple arms to fight off the demons. And they're elephants too, so they can just stomp on them.
Yeah.
So basically 8 foot tall light Jesus is standing in front of him and he's just like, oh, ecstasy is going through his body. You know how it goes, right? An 8 foot tall light Jesus picks him up, starts carrying him, and they start floating up this column of light. And he says he was really embarrassed because picture it, right? He's
dude, my wife's right here.
He's naked. He's in this stupid hospital gown. And he's basically been beaten up. Now, Jesus's light energy heals him and he's whole again. But as he's floating up,
is his butt pressed up against Jesus' arms?
In the arms of Jesus, he starts crying like a little bitch. Like, he's just blubbering. The way he's describing it, like he was actually embarrassed because it's like the Son of God's picking him up and you're just like blowing your nose on his sleeve. And he's just crying like a baby the whole time Jesus is taking him up. And at one point, he tries to get past his embarrassment of just blubbering. And he tries to look around to see where 8 foot tall light Jesus is taking him. And he looks down and he can just see the galaxy, like spinning planets and balls of light and things shooting around, and comets and at the center at the center of it is this insane giant light ball. And he realizes that it's the mind of God. It's some kind of God consciousness at the center of this whirling mass of the universe. And he's just overwhelmed, obviously, by all of this. And he says, I don't belong here. He starts crying to Jesus. He's like, I'm scum. I'm not worthy of this experience. You've made a mistake. I don't belong here. And for the first time, Jesus speaks to him and basically says, we don't make mistakes. You do belong here. And he can see in the distance these like light balls orbing around, like whizzing around, following each other. And Jesus kind of calls them over, and they come over, and he realizes they're other beings, and they come up, and there's like 7 of them, and they surround him. And he says they look like the perfect saints, like perfect angels with beautiful wings, butterfly people. And they're beaming this radiant love at him. You know, he's surrounded in ecstasy. We know how these stories go. But they know everything that he's thinking. And he said, I didn't know whether I'd be capable of controlling my thoughts because he knew that I'd be able to pick up on it. So he's like, don't think about boobies. Don't think about boobies. And immediately, of course, he's now thinking about boobies. And all the angels around him start laughing because he's thinking about boobies and because they can read his thoughts. And he says he hears their voices saying, don't worry. We know that you like boobies. You're upset though. What can we help you with? And he says, I don't belong here. And they basically say, you belong here. It's all been for this moment. And if you want us to appear in any other form, we can appear in any form that makes you comfortable, which is usually the argument for why people see different things during this experience.
Yeah, it's what you're comfortable with.
It's tailored.
It's the contact effect.
So because he had this, early childhood memory of Jesus that that was his tailored experience. That's one of the ideas.
And that's the thing, is that he might actually be experiencing some type of intelligence. And even though like he's perceiving it as God, it's just the universe. And it presents itself as whatever
it's got an infinite possibility of how it appears. So eventually he watches a life review in third person. He learns that God is love, blah, blah, blah. It's so like eye-rollingly a cliche at this stage. Especially since the only people we ever hear saying God is love are crazy people opening other people's mail.
At a conference.
God is love! God is love! Like they yell it at you and they look like they're about to stab you while yelling God is love, and their spit's hitting your face. And you're like, yeah, I agree with you. God is love. Calm down. So eventually he's shown, there's a lot of like life review stuff, and I won't bore you with the details because we know these stories. But eventually he's shown what the world will be like in the year 2185.
It's a rather specific time. He's not even going to be there. So why was he shown that?
And he asks, what's the future of humanity? And the angels basically say, well, there's this plan in 200 years, God's going to upgrade the spiritual consciousness of human beings, and the earth is going to be back to how he intended. And then he's like, well, show me what that is like. And so, the year 2185 is revealed to him. And the best way I can portray this is basically everyone is Native Americans. Like everyone's
what do you mean?
Living in teepees, hunting elk and buffalo. He says we're in this beautiful natural wooded setting. There's no evidence of human intrusion or man-made devices, because that's bad. They tell him that this is the future and they're in a garden that God intended. People came by and talked with one another, and they were dressed simply and wore exotic ornaments. They resembled Native Americans. Everyone spent the majority of their time with the children, teaching them about love. Oh my God. Can you imagine anything more boring? I mean, I love my children, but God, every day teaching them about love, I would last a week before I'd be like, okay, God, I've got to go work. I've got to go and work on a show. I'll come back. I'll be back tonight. I got a lot of stuff to do. Who's got time? Who wants to do that? No man wants to do that. So basically, all you do is hang out with your kids and teach them about love. There's no distinction between work and play. Everyone participates in child rearing and teaching kids is the most important activity of everyone's lives.
Oh, come on. You need a break.
How long does that last for? Like, do I have to teach other people's kids once I've taught my kids? Is that my whole existence? That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, that's your hell.
I don't want to teach your kids. I've already taught my kids. People raise food by sitting next to plants and communing with them. So basically, if you want a tomato, you sit next to a tomato plant and you're like,
take a whole heap of psilocybin and talk to it.
And a tomato grows out of it. And you're like, thanks, yoink, and you eat it. The people eat whatever grows immediately without cooking. So nothing can be cooked. You don't need to cook because you can just grow a pizza off a tree. The clothing is all made of finely woven fibers, and there's very little metal except in the ornaments. In the future, people will have sickness, but the treatment for disease will always be successful.
Love.
People will gather around the person and help through prayer, touch, and meditation, and the disease will be cured. Collectively, all the people in the world will control the weather. The climate will be regulated by the collective will of humankind. That kind of makes sense. Like if everyone's feeling down and gloomy, that means every Monday it's just rainy and shit. But Friday, the sun comes out. There'll be countless small communities of people all over the world, and each will have their own identity and culture. There will be many different languages, but all people will be able to communicate telepathically. There will be no technology because there will be no need for devices, since humans will have the power to control matter and energy, and people will stay within their communities unless they want to go check out another tribe. And
this guy is having his chain interdimensionally yanked, honestly. I mean, you can control matter and space-time, essentially, and there's no devices, and you're sitting around just raising your kids and talking to tomatoes.
You don't have time for space travel because you have to be a teacher at school.
Yeah.
Forever. So, yeah, you know how these stories go. Eventually, he's told he needs to go back to love. So he wakes up in the hospital bed. And he's like, everything hurts. He's filled with tubes.
Does he have a hole in his stomach?
Yeah, he's the doctor finally arrived to do the surgery on him. And his wife comes back into the room and she calls his name. And immediately he says, I love you. And she says, I love you too. And he says, no, it's all love. And she says, I love you. It's a huge ocean of love. And his wife says, well, lots of people love you. I know, but it's all love. And eventually she's like, yes, dear. You just got to let yourself go into the love. How are you feeling, honey? I'm okay, but listen to me. You've got to go into the love. It's got to be all love. Yes, dear, that's nice. We'll just have some more medicine. Lie down. So he basically turns into the worst patient in hospital ever because the doctors go to great lengths to save his life. And every time they help him, he basically goes, the Lord has cured me. Like there's a doctor who does a 20-hour shift, gets no sleep, like doesn't even get a baguette, and helps him. And then he comes out, he's like, oh, thank the Lord that I am cured. And the nurses and the doctors just think he's the biggest dickhead in the whole hospital because all he wants to do is talk about being in the love. So it's a great kind of message in the story, not necessarily of God is love, but it's, I think, a message of, what's the word I'm looking for? Zealotry. It's a message of zealotry.
Yeah.
Like you need to kind of, these NDE experiences are amazing.
However,
and I don't want to take away from the validity of what he went through, but obviously his feet need to come back down to earth. He needs to learn that.
Well, you still have to exist in this reality.
Yeah.
And I think this is a theme that's popped up in what you've been talking about today. Like we're talking about, the positive aspects of hallucinogenics and psilocybin and the such. But if you're, even zealous about that, it can lead to bad consequences. And at the start of the show, lots of failed relationships and ultimately probably pretty unhappy.
Yeah,
it's the same thing with this.
It's very hard for him to integrate what he'd experienced with his everyday life. And he stopped being an artist, from what I could gather. He just went
and screamed God is love?
Well, he went on to working with children because that was the message.
Oh.
But mostly sharing his message of love. He was actually told by the angels that love would save the planet when he went back. And he was actually like, well, how would... They told him all you got to do is go back and love your wife, actually.
Right. Okay.
And he kind of said, well, how will that save the planet? And then they said, well, if you love your wife, then she'll love another person and then it just spreads. That was their message.
So love herpes.
Ultimately, it was just God is love, which is why I said to you at the start of the show, it's one of these stories that kind of goes nowhere. Ultimately, the takeaway I had from this was he makes a point right at the end that a lot of people, since he started speaking openly about his NDE, have come up to him privately and said, my NDE was absolutely terrifying like yours. Like, it was absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
And all of these people, he said, do not want to talk about it.
No, we've noticed that. Like this, when I was saying before about, the reports of people having near-death experiences, overwhelmingly, the stories are positive because people are like, oh, I went and had this great experience and I saw grandma. But the people that have hellish experiences, they don't report them. And the data suggests that, they just don't happen that very often. It's like, no, it's because people don't want to report them because they don't want people thinking, I went to hell, I must be a bad person. Simple as that.
There's a bit of embarrassment in there, he said. Like people don't want to admit these things, that they went to these bad places or they had these bad experiences.
If you tell someone that you had a near-death experience and you went to hell, the response is going to be, well, what did you do?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you know
nothing.
I didn't do anything.
What are you talking about?
Nothing.
It was only a couple of times.
Yeah.
I'll link to the book in the show notes and everything else I've spoken about today. Let us know if you know anything more about the butterfly people, because maybe there has been some investigation into that, and there are some people that have gone on the record. Maybe I just wasn't able to find as much as possible today. But yeah, everything will be in the show notes. Make sure you check it out. And if you want more from this show, we've got a great Plus extension coming up. Some of the artwork in this story you're going to be talking about is kind of mind-blowing. So I can tell why you got roped into the story.
It's really, really cool. The artwork's all been done by Larry Blasey. And I'll link to a couple of the images in the show notes so you can see them for yourself. It's really well done original artwork that displays these things. They're kind of like, you get the impression at first that they're Bigfoot creatures, but I think they're anything but. There's something very odd going on here, and there could be some type of, maybe they're extraterrestrial.
Goblins?
Goblins, maybe, but there seems to be a psychic element and a poltergeist style element that's taking place here.
Do any rabbits get harmed in your segment?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, you know that because you saw one of the drawings.
I saw the artwork.
So, again, unfortunately, there is some very sad parts that do come up in the story, but overall, it's one of the most fascinating siege stories that I've ever encountered in regards to this phenomenon. And, the point that's made by the author is that essentially, these sorts of things have been happening all across the United States for many decades. But for the most part, like the negative near-death experience, people don't report them because they're fearful of the ridicule and they're fearful of actually coming up against the unknown and not being able to defend against it. You can sit out on your roof all night firing at these things and it still doesn't change. Then all of a sudden, as quickly as the phenomenon began, for some people it just...
You said earlier it's Skinwalker Ranch-esque as well.
Absolutely. It's very much along those lines. It has such a wide variety of things that show up that, very much like that.
To get access to that, head to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. You know the drill. $9 a month. Help support your favorite show. You get the big extensions we do on these episodes every single Friday, and Plus members get an exclusive show every single Tuesday as well. There's a concurrently running season just for Plus members. You also get a higher quality audio version of the show exclusive to Plus, totally ad-free version of the show on Plus as well. Discounts off digital products in our store, and all the features of our apps are unlocked for Plus members as well. mysteriousuniverse.org/plus for all the details. That's a wrap for this free edition of the show. Thanks for listening. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week. Welcome back to your Plus extension. Great to have you with us.